So, there I was, watching HOA President Karen Morrison try to have my PTSD service dog taken away while I'm having a panic attack on my own front porch. What she didn't know is that I'm a decorated combat veteran with a Purple Heart, and my dog isn't just a pet. He's federally protected medical equipment. Her little power trip was about to become a federal civil rights violation that would cost her everything, including a federal lawsuit that would make national headlines and change disability law enforcement forever. But first, what would you do if some power-hungry neighbor tried to take away your life-saving medical device disguised as community standards enforcement? Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from, because this story is about to expose the ugly truth about how veterans are treated in their own neighborhoods. Let me paint you the picture of how this nightmare started, because what happened next will make your blood boil with righteous fury. My name is Jake Martinez, and 18 months ago, I thought I'd finally found peace after surviving 3 combat tours in Afghanistan as a Marine Corps explosives disposal specialist. The kind of job where every wrong decision means you and your squad don't come home. The kind of job that leaves invisible scars that never fully heal. After spending 2 years in VA hospitals dealing with PTSD, traumatic brain injury, and survivor's guilt, I'd earned my disability benefits and bought a small house in Willowbrook Veterans Community, a quiet subdivision in Texas specifically designed for military families. The house came with 2 bedrooms, a small backyard perfect for my German Shepherd service dog, Ranger, and neighbors who understood the sound of nightmares at 3 in the morning. Ranger isn't just my companion, he's my lifeline. This magnificent animal was trained by Freedom Service Dogs of America to detect the onset of my panic attacks before I even realized they're happening. He can sense changes in my body chemistry that indicate an episode is coming and alerts me by placing his paws on my chest and maintaining eye contact until my breathing stabilizes. He's trained to wake me from night terrors, guide me to safe spaces during flashbacks, and even interrupt self-destructive behaviors that veterans sometimes develop when the memories become overwhelming. The training cost $30,000 and took 18 months to complete. Ranger knows over 40 specialized commands designed specifically for PTSD management. He can create physical barriers between me and crowds when I'm feeling overwhelmed. He can guide me to exits when my spatial awareness becomes compromised during anxiety episodes. He can even bring me my medication during severe episodes when I'm too disoriented to remember where I keep it. This isn't a pet who happens to be well behaved. This is a highly trained medical professional with 4 legs and a tail. For 6 months, life in Willowbrook Veterans Community was exactly what I needed. My neighbors were mostly other veterans who understood the challenges of transitioning back to civilian life. They understood why I sometimes needed to leave social gatherings abruptly. They understood why loud noises made me tense up. They understood why Ranger accompanied me everywhere, including to the mailbox, the grocery store, and community meetings. Most importantly, they understood that asking personal questions about someone's disabilities or service animal is not just rude. It's potentially traumatic for people who are working hard to rebuild their lives. Then Karen Morrison moved into the neighborhood and decided she needed to fix everything that was wrong with our peaceful community. She's 55 years old, former insurance claims investigator, and the kind of woman who sees veterans' disabilities as character flaws that can be corrected through proper discipline and community standards enforcement. She drives a red BMW sedan that she parks diagonally across 2 spaces because she believes her vehicle deserves special protection. She has this aggressive smile that makes you feel like you're being evaluated for weaknesses that she can exploit later. Karen's background in insurance gave her a dangerous combination of bureaucratic knowledge and predatory instincts. She knew how to research property values, homeowners insurance policies, and community regulations. She knew how to file complaints with government agencies and how to make official-sounding demands that intimidated people who didn't understand the difference between legitimate authority and manufactured harassment. Most dangerously, she thought she understood disability law because she'd spent years denying insurance claims for people with invisible disabilities. The first violation notice appeared on a Tuesday morning, tucked under my windshield wiper like a parking ticket designed to ruin your day. Bright orange paper with bold black lettering that screamed "Community Standards Violation." The complaint was breathtaking in its ignorance and cruelty. My service dog apparently violated Section 12.7 of the Community Pet Ownership Guidelines because German Shepherds were classified as aggressive breeds not suitable for family neighborhoods. The fine was $500, payable within 72 hours or face additional penalties including possible animal removal by county authorities. I read the notice 3 times, each reading making me angrier and more disturbed. Someone was trying to take away my medical equipment because they didn't like the way it looked. It was like fining someone for having a wheelchair that was too big, or demanding that diabetics use only insulin pumps that matched community aesthetic standards. The ignorance was staggering. The cruelty was breathtaking. This woman was literally trying to separate a disabled veteran from his life-saving medical device because she thought it might lower property values. Ranger sensed my rising anxiety and immediately placed his head on my knee, a trained behavior designed to interrupt the escalating stress response that could trigger a full panic attack. His gentle pressure and calm presence helped me think clearly, instead of reacting emotionally to what was obviously a coordinated attack disguised as community management. I realized that this wasn't just harassment. This was a federal civil rights violation that could result in serious criminal charges and massive financial penalties for anyone stupid enough to interfere with a service animal. The next morning, I called the office that handles service dog legal issues for the Disabled American Veterans Organization. The attorney I spoke with was a sharp woman named Lisa Chen, who specialized in Americans with Disabilities Act violations and veteran civil rights cases. She listened to my story without interrupting, occasionally asking questions about the exact language used in Karen's violation notice. When I finished, there was a long pause before she spoke. "Jake," she said, her voice carrying the controlled anger of someone who'd heard this story too many times before. "This woman has committed multiple federal violations by interfering with your service animal. The ADA is crystal clear about this. Service dogs are medical equipment, not pets subject to breed restrictions or community pet policies. What she's doing isn't just illegal, it's a hate crime against a disabled veteran that could result in federal prosecution and civil penalties that will financially destroy her." Lisa's words were both reassuring and sobering. I wasn't overreacting to Karen's harassment. She was committing serious federal crimes disguised as neighborhood rule enforcement. But that also meant I was dealing with someone who was either completely ignorant about federal disability law or arrogant enough to think those laws didn't apply to her personal preferences about community standards. "Can you work with me on documenting everything she does from now on?" Lisa asked. "We need to build an airtight case that will not only stop her harassment, but also send a message to other communities that veterans' disability rights are non-negotiable. Your situation could help protect thousands of other disabled veterans from similar harassment if we handle this correctly." I looked out my kitchen window at Ranger playing in the backyard, this magnificent animal who had literally saved my life dozens of times by detecting panic attacks before they became overwhelming. The idea that someone could take him away from me because she didn't like his breed was terrifying and infuriating in equal measure. But the idea that my experience could protect other veterans from similar attacks gave me a sense of purpose that I hadn't felt since leaving the military. The harassment escalated quickly once Karen realized that I wasn't going to pay her fraudulent fine and surrender my service animal without a fight. The second violation notice arrived 4 days later, this time delivered personally by Karen herself. I watched through my living room window as she walked up my driveway in her spotless white sneakers, carrying her clipboard like a weapon designed for bureaucratic warfare. She moved with the confidence of someone who had never been challenged by anyone brave enough to understand federal disability law. This notice was even more outrageous than the first. Ranger apparently violated community noise ordinances because he barked during my nightmares. According to Karen's latest legal fiction, disturbing the peace between the hours of 11 p.m. and 7 a.m. constituted a nuisance that threatened the quality of life for other residents. The fine was $1,500. The timeline for compliance was 48 hours. The threatened consequences included animal removal and possible eviction proceedings for creating an ongoing community disturbance. The ignorance behind this violation was staggering even by Karen's standards. She was essentially fining me for having PTSD symptoms that required medical intervention by my service animal. Ranger's barking during my night terrors wasn't random noise. It was trained medical behavior designed to interrupt traumatic episodes before they became dangerous. He was literally performing life-saving medical procedures that happened to make noise, and she was treating it like an inconsiderate neighbor playing loud music. I called Lisa immediately and read her the new violation notice. Her response was immediate and furious. This woman is now discriminating against you based on your disability symptoms. She's essentially demanding that you stop having PTSD or face financial penalties and housing loss. This is textbook disability discrimination that violates multiple federal laws. We're not just talking about ADA violations anymore. This is Fair Housing Act territory, which carries even more serious penalties. The documentation process began immediately. Lisa connected me with a federal investigator who specialized in disability rights violations. We installed security cameras around my property to record any future harassment. I started keeping a detailed journal of every interaction with Karen, including dates, times, witnesses, and exact quotes of everything she said. Most importantly, we began building a case that would expose Karen's harassment as part of a broader pattern of discrimination against disabled veterans. The investigation revealed that I wasn't Karen's first target. She had previously harassed 2 other veterans in the neighborhood, both of whom had eventually moved away rather than fight her bureaucratic terrorism. One was a Vietnam veteran with a mobility service dog who had been fined repeatedly for having a pet that was too large for community standards. Another was an Iraq War veteran with an emotional support animal who had been threatened with eviction for having an unregistered pet that violated lease agreements. Both veterans had been too traumatized and overwhelmed by Karen's harassment to understand that they had federal civil rights that protected them from exactly this kind of discrimination. They had assumed that Homeowners Association rules automatically overrode disability accommodations. They had believed that fighting back would only make their housing situations worse. They had been exactly the kind of vulnerable targets that predators like Karen relied on to avoid consequences for their criminal behavior. The pattern was clear and legally devastating. Karen wasn't just harassing individual pet owners. She was systematically targeting disabled veterans and using their disabilities against them. She was weaponizing community standards to force people with invisible disabilities to either hide their medical needs or leave the neighborhood entirely. It was a deliberate campaign of discrimination disguised as property management. 3 weeks after the second violation notice, Karen made the mistake that would end her harassment campaign forever. I was having a particularly difficult morning, triggered by construction noise that reminded me of improvised explosive devices. Ranger was performing his trained alert behaviors, maintaining physical contact and providing deep pressure therapy to help me manage the panic response. I was sitting on my front porch using breathing techniques my VA therapist had taught me, with Ranger lying across my feet to provide grounding pressure. Karen chose that moment to march across my lawn and demand that I control my aggressive animal or face immediate animal removal proceedings. She had no training in trauma response. She had no understanding of what she was witnessing. She saw a veteran having a medical episode and decided it was the perfect time to assert her imaginary authority over my federally protected medical equipment. "Get that vicious animal away from you," she screamed, pointing at Ranger with her clipboard. "He's clearly agitated and dangerous. I'm calling animal control right now to have him removed as a public safety threat. You obviously can't control him properly and he doesn't belong in a family neighborhood." Ranger's response was perfect and professionally trained. He moved to position himself between me and the perceived threat while maintaining physical contact to continue providing medical support. He didn't bark, growl, or show any aggressive behavior. He simply created a protective barrier while continuing to perform his trained medical duties. His calm professionalism was a stark contrast to Karen's hysterical behavior. I activated the recording app on my phone and began documenting everything Karen said and did. Her next words provided the smoking gun evidence that would destroy her in federal court. "You veterans think you can get away with anything by claiming disabilities that nobody can see. Your dog is just a pet that you're using to get special treatment and avoid following the same rules as everyone else. I've researched your whole scam, and I know exactly what you're trying to pull." Those words constituted explicit disability discrimination based on my veteran status and invisible disabilities. She had admitted that she was targeting me, specifically because she didn't believe my PTSD was legitimate. She had revealed that her harassment was motivated by prejudice against veterans with invisible disabilities. She had handed me the evidence I needed to destroy her both legally and financially. The federal investigation that followed was swift and thorough. Karen's harassment of disabled veterans had violated the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Fair Housing Act, and several federal civil rights statutes that protected veterans from discrimination based on their service-connected disabilities. The penalties for these violations included massive financial fines, federal monitoring of her future behavior, and criminal prosecution if she continued her harassment campaign. What we discovered during the investigation shocked even experienced federal civil rights attorneys. Karen's computer contained detailed research files on every veteran in our neighborhood, including medical information she had obtained through illegal means. She had been accessing veterans' disability records through corrupt contacts at insurance companies, creating psychological profiles designed to identify vulnerabilities she could exploit through bureaucratic harassment. The scope of her operation was staggering. She had targeted 17 different veterans across 3 different communities over the past 4 years. Her methods were sophisticated and cruel. She would research each veteran's specific disabilities, then create harassment campaigns designed to trigger their worst symptoms. Veterans with PTSD received noise complaints timed to disrupt their sleep schedules. Veterans with mobility issues received violations for using disability parking without visible disabilities. Veterans with traumatic brain injuries received complex bureaucratic demands designed to overwhelm their cognitive processing abilities. Agent Patricia Rodriguez from the FBI's Civil Rights Division explained the full scope of what we were dealing with. Karen wasn't just a neighborhood bully who happened to target veterans. She was running a systematic campaign of disability-based harassment that qualified as organized civil rights terrorism. She had been studying federal disability law not to comply with it, but to find ways to circumvent protections and cause maximum psychological damage to vulnerable veterans. The investigation revealed Karen's financial motivation for targeting veterans. She had been collecting bounties from property management companies and insurance firms for driving disabled residents out of neighborhoods. Her harassment campaigns were designed to force veterans to relocate, allowing these companies to avoid paying for disability accommodations and accessibility modifications. She had been paid over $60,000 in the past 2 years for successfully forcing disabled veterans to abandon their homes. The depth of Karen's criminal network shocked even seasoned federal investigators. Her operation extended beyond simple harassment into sophisticated financial crimes involving multiple corporate entities. She had established partnerships with unscrupulous real estate investors who specialized in acquiring homes from distressed sellers at below-market prices. When veterans were forced to relocate due to her harassment campaigns, these investors would purchase their properties through shell companies for 30 to 40% below fair market value. The scheme worked with clockwork precision. Karen would identify veterans with valuable properties and invisible disabilities, then launch targeted harassment campaigns designed to trigger medical crises that forced urgent relocations. While veterans struggled with PTSD episodes and medical emergencies caused by her psychological warfare, her investor partners would approach with cash offers that seemed like lifelines to families desperate to escape persecution. Federal financial crimes investigators discovered that Karen had been receiving performance bonuses based on the property values of homes she helped acquire for her criminal network. A Vietnam veteran's $300,000 home that sold for $180,000 during a harassment-induced crisis had generated a $15,000 commission for Karen. A disabled Marine's $250,000 property that sold for $160,000 after months of bureaucratic terrorism had earned her an $11,000 bonus. Her criminal enterprise had generated over $400,000 in commissions while destroying dozens of veterans' financial security. The psychological evaluation ordered by federal prosecutors revealed a personality profile that was genuinely disturbing. Dr. Amanda Foster, a forensic psychologist specializing in predatory behavior, spent 40 hours interviewing Karen and reviewing her personal documents. The evaluation revealed what Dr. Foster termed weaponized ableism, a systematic belief system that viewed disabled veterans as fraudulent parasites who deserved punishment for claiming benefits they hadn't legitimately earned. Karen's journal entries provided chilling insights into her motivations and methods. She wrote about disabled veterans with clinical detachment, describing them as malingerers exploiting government sympathy and professional victims, gaming the system for unearned benefits. She documented her harassment campaigns like a researcher studying laboratory subjects, celebrating each veteran's psychological breakdown as evidence that their disabilities were fabricated weaknesses rather than legitimate medical conditions. One particularly disturbing entry described her strategy for targeting Captain Robert Chen, the veteran with traumatic brain injury. Karen had researched TBI symptoms and learned that cognitive overload could trigger severe disorientation and memory problems. She had deliberately created complex bureaucratic demands with contradictory requirements and impossible deadlines, knowing that Chen's brain injury would prevent him from processing the information effectively. She documented his confusion and distress with clinical precision, noting which triggers produced the most severe symptoms. Another journal entry detailed her campaign against Master Sergeant Patricia Williams, the veteran with severe PTSD and a trained service dog. Karen had studied PTSD triggers and developed a systematic approach to creating environmental stressors that would overwhelm Patricia's coping mechanisms. She scheduled landscaping crews to operate early in the morning when Patricia was most vulnerable to noise-induced flashbacks. She arranged for construction projects during times when Patricia typically used her service dog for anxiety management. She even coordinated with corrupt animal control officers to conduct wellness checks on Patricia's service dog during periods when her PTSD symptoms were most severe. The federal grand jury investigation that followed exposed corruption at multiple levels of local government. Karen had been paying bribes to animal control officers, code enforcement officials, and even some law enforcement personnel to support her harassment campaigns against disabled veterans. These corrupt officials had been filing false reports, conducting illegal searches, and providing Karen with confidential information about veterans' medical conditions and legal vulnerabilities. Agent Patricia Rodriguez explained the full scope of the federal investigation. The operation, codenamed Justice Shield, had identified a nationwide network of similar schemes targeting disabled veterans in communities across 17 states. Karen's operation had been one of the most sophisticated, but investigators had discovered dozens of copycat schemes using her methods to exploit vulnerable veteran populations. The coordinated federal response involved simultaneous raids on over 60 locations, including Karen's home, her business associates' offices, corrupt government officials' residences, and the headquarters of property management companies that had been paying for her services. Federal agents seized over $2 million in cash, hundreds of thousands of dollars in real estate assets, and enough documentary evidence to support prosecutions of 83 individuals involved in various aspects of the criminal network. The evidence collection from Karen's home revealed the industrial scale of her operation. Her basement had been converted into a command center with multiple computer workstations, surveillance equipment, and detailed files on hundreds of potential targets. Wall-mounted maps showed veteran concentration areas across multiple states, with individual properties marked according to their potential value and the vulnerability profiles of their disabled veteran owners. Karen's computer systems contained databases with detailed psychological profiles of over 300 disabled veterans, including stolen medical records, financial information, and family vulnerability assessments. She had categorized veterans by disability type, with separate targeting strategies for PTSD sufferers, amputees, veterans with traumatic brain injuries, and those with multiple service-connected conditions. Her research had been comprehensive and professionally sophisticated, rivaling intelligence operations conducted by experienced law enforcement agencies. The financial records seized from Karen's operation revealed the true scope of her criminal enterprise. She had been operating through 7 different shell companies, each designed to hide specific aspects of her money laundering and property acquisition schemes. Her total criminal revenue over 4 years exceeded $800,000, with individual harassment campaigns generating between $5,000 and $25,000, depending on the property values involved and the complexity of the psychological warfare required. The civil lawsuit that Lisa filed on my behalf expanded dramatically as federal investigators uncovered the full scope of Karen's criminal network. What began as a disability discrimination case evolved into a complex racketeering lawsuit targeting multiple defendants, including property management companies, corrupt government officials, and the financial institutions that had helped launder Karen's criminal proceeds. The discovery phase of the expanded lawsuit revealed systematic violations of veterans' civil rights that extended far beyond individual harassment cases. Karen's network had been operating like an organized crime syndicate, with specialized roles for different participants. Some focused on identifying vulnerable targets through illegal access to medical records. Others developed psychological warfare strategies tailored to specific disability types. Still others handled the financial aspects of property acquisition and money laundering. The expert witnesses who testified during the civil proceedings painted a devastating picture of the psychological and financial damage Karen's network had inflicted on veteran families. Dr. Michael Santos, a specialist in veteran trauma recovery, explained how Karen's harassment campaigns had been designed to exploit the specific neurological vulnerabilities associated with different types of service-connected disabilities. Veterans with PTSD experience hypervigilance and exaggerated startle responses that make them particularly vulnerable to bureaucratic harassment designed to create chronic stress. Karen's violation, notices, and legal threats triggered the same neurological responses that veterans had experienced during combat situations, essentially recreating warfare conditions in residential neighborhoods. Her campaigns had been psychological terrorism conducted against disabled veterans in their own homes. Veterans with traumatic brain injuries have cognitive processing difficulties that make complex bureaucratic demands especially overwhelming. Karen had researched TBI symptoms and created harassment strategies that deliberately exploited these cognitive vulnerabilities. Her demands were designed to be impossible to fulfill correctly, ensuring that veterans would fail to comply and face escalating penalties that justified further harassment. The testimony from medical experts established that Karen's harassment campaigns constituted a form of medical abuse that interfered with veterans' treatment and recovery processes. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a specialist in service animal training, explained how removing veteran service animals was equivalent to confiscating insulin from diabetics or pacemakers from cardiac patients. The interference with medical equipment caused immediate physical and psychological crises that often required emergency intervention. The prosecution's case was strengthened by testimony from federal agents who had infiltrated Karen's network during the investigation. Agent Michael Thompson had posed as a corrupt real estate investor interested in purchasing properties from distressed veteran sellers. His undercover work revealed that Karen's operation had been expanding into new markets and developing increasingly sophisticated targeting strategies. Karen's network had been researching veterans' financial vulnerabilities, including mortgage default risks, medical debt burdens, and family crisis situations that could be exploited to force property sales. They had developed profiles of veterans who were most likely to sell quickly at below-market prices when subjected to sustained harassment campaigns. They had even created psychological assessment tools for predicting which veterans would break down fastest under bureaucratic pressure. The undercover investigation also revealed that Karen had been training other individuals to replicate her methods in new markets. She had developed a comprehensive training program that taught participants how to research veterans' disabilities, create targeted harassment campaigns, and coordinate with corrupt officials to maximize psychological pressure. Her criminal enterprise had been operating like a franchise system, spreading across multiple states and targeting thousands of vulnerable veterans. The trial proceedings revealed the sophisticated legal strategies Karen's network had developed to avoid prosecution for their crimes. They had researched federal disability law extensively, not to comply with it, but to find loopholes and technicalities that might provide legal cover for their harassment campaigns. They had developed seemingly legitimate pretexts for targeting veterans' service animals and disability accommodations. Karen's defense team tried to argue that her activities constituted legitimate community management rather than disability discrimination. They claimed that her violation notices and legal threats were standard Homeowners Association enforcement activities that applied equally to all residents regardless of their disability status. This defense strategy collapsed when prosecutors introduced evidence of Karen's research into veterans' specific disabilities and her documented strategies for exploiting those disabilities. The prosecution demonstrated that Karen had never targeted non-disabled residents with similar harassment campaigns. Her violation notices were specifically tailored to trigger symptoms associated with particular service-connected disabilities. Her legal threats were timed to coincide with veterans' medical appointments and therapy sessions. Her enforcement activities were designed to interfere with medical treatment rather than maintain community standards. The jury was particularly influenced by testimony from Karen's own accomplices, who had cooperated with federal investigators in exchange for reduced sentences. These witnesses described planning meetings where Karen had discussed specific veterans' medical vulnerabilities and developed strategies for exploiting those vulnerabilities to force property sales. They testified about Karen's celebrations when veterans experienced medical crises caused by her harassment campaigns. The verdict was unanimous and comprehensive. Karen Morrison was convicted on 23 federal counts, including disability discrimination, civil rights violations, conspiracy to deprive veterans of their federally protected accommodations, healthcare fraud, money laundering, racketeering, and operating a continuing criminal enterprise. Her conviction carried automatic sentences totaling 25 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 18 years. The financial penalties were equally devastating. Karen was ordered to pay over $1 million in damages, fines, and restitution to her victims. All of her assets were forfeited, including her home, vehicles, bank accounts, and business interests. The proceeds were distributed to veterans advocacy organizations and used to fund legal support for disabled veterans facing similar discrimination. The federal monitoring requirements essentially ended any possibility of Karen resuming her criminal activities after her eventual release from prison. She was prohibited from any involvement with homeowners associations, property management companies, or community organizations. She was banned from accessing veterans' medical records or disability information. She was required to undergo psychological evaluation and treatment for her predatory behaviors toward disabled individuals. But the most significant impact of Karen's prosecution extended far beyond individual justice. The Department of Justice used her case to establish new enforcement protocols for investigating disability discrimination against veterans. Federal agencies developed specialized training programs for recognizing and prosecuting harassment campaigns that target veterans' service-connected disabilities. The congressional hearings that followed Karen's conviction brought unprecedented attention to the systematic targeting of disabled veterans by criminal organizations masquerading as community management operations. The House Subcommittee on Veterans Affairs conducted a comprehensive investigation that revealed similar schemes operating in over 30 states, affecting thousands of veteran families who had been forced from their homes through psychological warfare disguised as bureaucratic enforcement. Senator Patricia Williams, herself a decorated Army veteran, led the Senate inquiry into what investigators termed predatory ableism networks that had been systematically exploiting disabled veterans across the country. The Senate hearings featured testimony from over 50 veterans who had been targeted by similar schemes, revealing a nationwide pattern of criminal organizations that had weaponized community management against vulnerable veteran populations. The legislative response was swift and comprehensive. Congress passed the Veterans Disability Protection Act with overwhelming bipartisan support, creating enhanced federal criminal penalties for anyone who knowingly interferes with veterans' service animals or disability accommodations. The law established mandatory minimum sentences of 5 years for first-time offenders and up to 25 years for repeat offenders or those operating organized criminal enterprises targeting disabled veterans. The Veterans Protection Act included revolutionary provisions for federal oversight of communities with high concentrations of disabled veterans. Homeowners associations and property management companies operating in veteran-heavy areas would be subject to annual federal audits to ensure compliance with disability laws. The legislation also created a federal victim compensation fund, financed through criminal forfeiture proceeds from prosecuted disability discrimination cases. The law established the Veterans Civil Rights Enforcement Division within the Department of Justice, a specialized unit dedicated exclusively to investigating and prosecuting crimes against disabled veterans. The division was granted enhanced investigative powers, including the ability to conduct proactive investigations of suspected discrimination networks and the authority to pursue federal civil rights charges without waiting for individual complaints. Our neighborhood's transformation after Karen's federal prosecution became a national model for veteran-inclusive community development and disability rights implementation. The Willowbrook Veterans Community received federal designation as a Veteran Disability Rights Demonstration Site, attracting researchers, policymakers, and community developers from across the country who wanted to study successful models of veteran integration and disability accommodation. The community healing process involved extensive trauma-informed support services for veterans and families who had been victimized by Karen's psychological warfare campaigns. The Department of Veterans Affairs established a specialized clinic in our community that provided comprehensive treatment for veterans whose service-connected disabilities had been weaponized against them by criminal harassment operations. Dr. Jennifer Rodriguez, the clinic's director, explained how Karen's harassment campaigns had created a unique form of secondary trauma that required specialized treatment approaches. Veterans who had survived combat situations and overcome war-related disabilities found themselves re-traumatized by psychological warfare conducted in their own neighborhoods. The betrayal of community trust and the exploitation of their disabilities created complex trauma responses that traditional PTSD treatment couldn't adequately address. The clinic developed innovative treatment protocols that address both the original combat trauma and the secondary trauma caused by disability-based persecution. Veterans participated in group therapy sessions where they could share experiences with others who had been targeted by similar schemes. They received legal advocacy training that helped them understand and protect their civil rights. Most importantly, they reconnected with their sense of dignity and worth that had been systematically attacked by Karen's criminal organization. Ranger's role in exposing Karen's criminal enterprise made him a national symbol of service animal rights and veteran dignity. He was featured in documentaries about disability, discrimination, congressional testimony about service animal protection laws, and educational programs that taught the public about the life-saving medical functions performed by trained service animals. His calm professionalism and obvious dedication to his medical duties helped change public perception of service animals from pets with special privileges to essential medical equipment deserving legal protection. The Martinez Veterans Advocacy Foundation grew rapidly into one of the nation's premier organizations, providing legal support, educational resources, and community advocacy for disabled veterans facing discrimination. The Foundation's legal clinic provided free representation for veterans dealing with disability discrimination, while its educational programs trained thousands of veterans about their federal civil rights and the legal protections available to them. The Foundation's research division conducted groundbreaking studies on the intersection of veteran disabilities, housing discrimination, and criminal exploitation of vulnerable populations. Their research documented the sophisticated methods used by criminal organizations to identify and target disabled veterans, the psychological techniques employed to trigger medical crises, and the financial networks that profited from veterans' suffering. One particularly important study revealed that veterans with invisible disabilities were 5 times more likely to experience housing discrimination than veterans with visible disabilities. The research showed that criminal organizations specifically targeted veterans with PTSD, traumatic brain injuries, and other invisible conditions because their disabilities were easier to question and their medical needs were more likely to be misunderstood by community members and government officials. The Foundation's educational curriculum became the national standard for veteran disability rights training. The curriculum was adopted by veterans organizations in all 50 states, military transition programs, and federal agencies responsible for enforcing disability rights. The program taught veterans how to recognize discrimination when it occurred, document harassment effectively, and access legal resources for fighting back against criminal exploitation. The National Veterans Disability Discrimination database established by the Foundation became the primary tool for tracking patterns of harassment against disabled veterans and identifying emerging criminal networks before they could establish extensive operations. The database maintained detailed records of discrimination complaints, prosecution outcomes, and the methods used by criminal organizations to target veteran populations. Federal law enforcement agencies use the database to identify geographic clusters of discrimination complaints that might indicate organized criminal activity. Prosecutors use the database to establish patterns of criminal behavior that supported racketeering charges. Veterans advocates use the database to identify communities where proactive intervention might prevent criminal organizations from establishing operations targeting vulnerable veteran populations. The annual Veterans Rights Conference held in our community became the premier gathering for disability rights advocates, federal law enforcement officials, veterans' legal organizations, and policymakers working to protect disabled veterans from criminal exploitation. The conference attracted over 8,000 participants each year and generated policy recommendations that influenced federal legislation and enforcement strategies. The conference featured workshops on recognizing and documenting disability discrimination, legal clinics where veterans could receive free legal advice consultations about their rights, and training sessions for law enforcement officers learning to investigate crimes against disabled veterans. The conference also provided a forum for veterans to share their experiences and connect with others who had overcome similar challenges. 5 years after Karen's conviction, the conference hosted a special session where veterans who had been victimized by similar criminal networks shared their stories and discussed the long-term impact of the legal and legislative changes that had resulted from their courage in speaking out. The session was both heartbreaking and inspiring, demonstrating how individual acts of courage could create systemic changes that protected thousands of other veterans from similar exploitation. 10 years after Karen's prosecution, I was invited to address a joint session of Congress about the ongoing need for federal protection of disabled veterans' civil rights. My testimony focused on the sophisticated evolution of criminal organizations that target vulnerable veteran populations and the importance of continued vigilance in protecting veterans' hard-earned benefits and accommodations. The speech highlighted how criminal networks had adapted their methods in response to enhanced federal enforcement, developing new techniques for exploiting disabled veterans while attempting to avoid prosecution under the strengthened laws that had resulted from Karen's case. These new methods included cyber harassment campaigns, manipulation of social media to isolate veterans from support networks, and coordination with corrupt officials in multiple jurisdictions to complicate federal investigations. The congressional address resulted in additional legislation, strengthening federal protections for disabled veterans and expanding the resources available for investigating and prosecuting crimes against veteran populations. The Enhanced Veterans Protection Act created new federal crimes specifically targeting cyber harassment of disabled veterans, and established enhanced penalties for criminal organizations that cross state lines to exploit veteran populations. The legislation also established the Veterans Civil Rights Research Institute, a federally funded organization dedicated to studying criminal exploitation of disabled veterans and developing innovative prevention and enforcement strategies. The institute received a mandate to conduct ongoing research into emerging threats against veteran populations and to provide early warning systems for communities where criminal organizations might be establishing operations. 15 years after Karen Morrison first tried to take away my service animal, the transformation of veteran disability rights enforcement had created a comprehensive protection system that had prevented thousands of veterans from experiencing similar exploitation. Federal agencies had developed sophisticated investigation techniques for identifying criminal networks targeting disabled veterans. Prosecutors had clear legal frameworks for pursuing aggressive prosecutions that resulted in serious prison sentences and massive financial penalties. Communities across the country had implemented evidence-based programs for supporting disabled veterans and preventing discrimination before it could escalate into criminal harassment. Veterans organizations had effective tools for educating their members about civil rights protections and connecting them with legal resources when discrimination occurred. Most importantly, the cultural understanding of veteran disabilities had evolved dramatically. The public education campaigns that had grown out of Karen's prosecution had helped Americans understand that veteran service-connected disabilities were earned through sacrifice for their country and deserved respect rather than suspicion. Service animals were increasingly recognized as essential medical equipment, rather than pets with special privileges. Bullies who target veterans' disabilities now face a coordinated federal response that includes specialized prosecutors, enhanced criminal penalties, and sophisticated investigation techniques that can identify and dismantle criminal networks before they can establish extensive operations. The legal precedents established through Karen's prosecution have created a framework for aggressive federal enforcement that protects disabled veterans' civil rights while sending clear messages to potential criminals about the serious consequences of targeting veteran populations. The victory tastes sweeter than any peace I found in military service, sweeter than the quiet morning coffee with Ranger by my side, sweeter than watching thousands of veterans learn to protect their federal civil rights through the programs and resources that grew out of our struggle against Karen's criminal enterprise. Ranger continues to perform his life-saving medical duties every day, now protected by comprehensive federal laws that recognize service animals as essential medical equipment, deserving the same protections afforded to any life-saving medical device. My PTSD symptoms continue to require daily medical management, but now that management takes place in a community that understands and respects veterans' disabilities, the peace I sought when I moved to this neighborhood is still here, now protected by federal law, community education, and the certainty that anyone who targets veterans' disabilities will face swift and devastating legal consequences that will serve as permanent warnings to others who might consider similar criminal enterprises. Share your own veteran discrimination story in the comments below, because every nightmare teaches us to recognize civil rights violations before they destroy other military families. Hit that subscribe button for more stories about disabled veterans refusing to let community tyrants win through ignorance and manufactured authority. The ripple effects of Karen's prosecution continue expanding decades later, creating waves of protection that reach veterans I'll never meet in communities I'll never visit. Last month, I received a letter from a Marine veteran in Oregon whose HOA tried to ban his seizure alert dog. He cited the Martinez case precedent, and within 48 hours, the HOA board issued a formal apology and changed their policies. The legal framework we helped establish saved him months of harassment and thousands of dollars in legal fees. Similar letters arrive weekly from veterans across the country whose stories follow familiar patterns but end differently because of the legal protections we fought to create. A Navy veteran in Florida whose PTSD service dog was targeted by her condo association. An Army veteran in Montana whose mobility assistance dog faced breed restrictions. A Coast Guard veteran in Maine whose medical alert dog was classified as a prohibited pet. All of them use the legal precedents, federal enforcement protocols, and advocacy resources that grew from our battle against Karen's criminal enterprise. The Karen Morrison Veterans Protection Database now tracks over 10,000 successful interventions where veterans used our legal framework to stop discrimination before it escalated into harassment campaigns. Federal agents use the database to identify patterns that might indicate emerging criminal networks. Prosecutors use it to build stronger cases against organized discrimination operations. Most importantly, veterans use it to understand they're not alone in facing these challenges, and that effective legal remedies exist. The annual scholarship program established through Karen's forfeiture proceeds has funded college educations for over 500 children of disabled veterans. These students carry forward the mission of protecting veteran rights into careers in law, medicine, social work, and federal law enforcement. They represent the next generation of advocates who understand that protecting vulnerable populations requires both institutional knowledge and personal commitment to justice. The transformation reaches beyond individual cases into systemic changes that protect entire veteran communities. Military-based transition programs now include mandatory education about civilian disability rights. VA hospitals provide legal advocacy training as part of veteran rehabilitation services. Veterans organizations have embedded legal rights education into their standard support programs. Federal agencies have developed predictive analytics that identify communities where veteran discrimination might emerge before it becomes established criminal activity. Early intervention teams work with local law enforcement and veterans advocates to address problematic patterns before they escalate into the kind of organized harassment Karen had perfected. The international impact surprises me most. Veterans organizations in Canada, Australia, and the United Kingdom have adopted our advocacy models and legal frameworks for protecting disabled veterans from community-level discrimination. The United Nations cited our case in developing international protocols for protecting disabled military veterans' civil rights. 20 years after that first violation notice appeared on my windshield, I watched Ranger's successor, a young German shepherd named Scout, perform the same life-saving medical duties with the same calm professionalism. Ranger passed away peacefully at age 14. Still working, still protecting, still proving every day that service animals are medical professionals deserving respect and legal protection. Scout carries forward Ranger's legacy while benefiting from the legal protections his predecessor helped establish. No one questions Scout's presence in stores, restaurants, or community meetings. No one challenges his medical necessity or suggests he might be better suited for a different neighborhood. The cultural transformation that grew from our legal victory has created a world where service animals are recognized as essential medical equipment rather than controversial accommodations. The peace I found in this neighborhood remains intact, strengthened by knowledge that the legal and educational systems we created will protect future generations of disabled veterans from the kind of predatory harassment that once threatened to destroy my recovery. The morning coffee tastes sweeter, knowing that veterans across the country wake up in communities where their disabilities are respected rather than weaponized against them. Standing on my porch at sunset, watching Scout alert to a minor anxiety spike and provide immediate medical intervention, I'm reminded that individual courage can create systemic change that outlasts any single person's lifetime. The legal precedents we established will protect veterans for generations. The educational programs we developed will continue teaching communities about disability rights long after we're gone. The federal enforcement mechanisms we helped create will continue dismantling criminal networks that target vulnerable populations. Karen Morrison thought she was dealing with a vulnerable veteran who would surrender his medical equipment rather than fight bureaucratic harassment. She discovered instead that some fights are worth having, some principles are worth defending, and some victories create protection for countless others who face similar battles. Her criminal enterprise collapsed, but the justice system we helped strengthen continues protecting disabled veterans across the nation. This is more than revenge. This is transformation. This is proof that when good people refuse to accept injustice, they can create changes that protect everyone who comes after them. Remember, sometimes standing up to neighborhood tyrants doesn't just save yourself, it saves everyone around you. When good people refuse to be intimidated by fake authority, entire communities can break free from fear. Thanks for watching HOA Revenge Stories, where we prove that every HOA Karen eventually meets their match.